Hello there, friendly neighbors, and welcome back to my channel. Voiceover Kenya is coming in hot, cutting myself off real quickly there. I think that's a new record. I just wanted to quickly say, before y'all start watching this video, I understand this video is really long, but there comes a point where you have 3.5 hours of footage and you've cut it down as much as you can without cutting out the important information that you don't want to skip over. So if this isn't the type of video that you're really interested in, you're not super vibing with it, that is totally a-okay, mate. I will see you next week. Don't feel like you have to watch this video. I just personally found the subject matter to be pretty interesting, and I know that I definitely have a couple of subscribers who also are going to find this interesting. So for those like 10 homies, hey there, homie, we're in here together. A second point I want to make, I do know my eyelashes look terrible in this video. I was not wearing my glasses for the second week in a row, and so I just couldn't see that they were like doing what they were doing. Middle school logic here, I have now made fun of myself, so legally you can't make fun of me because I beat you to the punch. Last point I want to make before I'm done here, I had no idea what background music to use for this video, so I'm just gonna stick with the classics, and we're going jazz. So here you go. Now sit back and enjoy me talking about ferret care for 35 minutes. I was at the used bookstore, and I was buying used books. It might have been manga. Possibly. It was. I'm not gonna lie. It was manga. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. I found the 8th volume of Shiguchara, though, and one of the Fullmetal Alchemist light novels that I didn't have. So that was really exciting for me. So while I was perusing the used bookstore, I wandered into a section that I had never been in before. And whenever I go to the used bookstore, I kind of stick to just like the comics and the manga and stuff, because that's what I care about. But I went into like the life section, and there was an animal section. And then I found a book on ferrets. And then I found another book on ferrets. And I found several books on ferrets. And I kind of vaguely flipped through one of them. And it said some things. I have 4 books that I'm going to be reacting to today. These are the only 4 books that they had in the very small bookstore I was at, and I didn't feel like going to a second store because I didn't have time, nor did I have money. I'm not reading these books because I want to bash the authors. I'm not saying that they're terrible people and that they made anyone who read this book not take care of their ferret. Quite the opposite, actually. I want to read these books because I think it's going to be super interesting to see where ferret care has come from in the last 20 to 30 years. Even just looking at the 2 different Ferrets for Dummies books that I have. This one published in 2007 and this one published in 2020. There are a lot of differences between these 2 books, which are by the same author. And I think that's just a testament to, even in just those 13 years, how much ferret care has changed and evolved as we've learned more things and understand the ferret a little bit better. Just a quick shout out to Ferrets for Dummies 3rd edition. If you are looking for a good book on ferret care, I'm just gonna continually recommend this book until the day I die. I have a review of it on my channel, which I will have linked up in the corner somewhere here if you want to hear my opinion on it. I don't agree with every single thing in this textbook, but I don't think I'm ever gonna agree with every single thing any one person has to say about ferrets because I just have my opinions. But all in all, I think that this is a really, really great book, and I think that if you are wanting a book as a ferret care resource, this one's the one you want. So I want to start off today's video with the oldest book. It is called Ferrets. Very clear title. We know exactly what this book is about. And it is by Dr. Wendy Winstead. This book was published in 1989. So this book is from the 80s. Right off the bat, I'm looking at this book, and the first thing I see is a ferret, and he's got a collar on. Don't put collars on your ferrets. They aren't safe. It's a bad idea. The next picture you have, again, ferrets with collars on them. I think that was pretty standard practice back then, so I can't hate on something that people used to think that you had to do. A small towel or some clean rags can be used as bedding, so it doesn't mention using sawdust, which is actually something that I was thinking these older books might do. People who don't know much about ferrets or who are just misunderstand the cage of a ferret will sometimes put sawdust and stuff like that in their ferrets' cages. This is super unnecessary. It's actually really not good for your ferrets' respiratory systems. Ferrets are very easily litter trained. It's their natural desire to want to use the litter box, so as long as you're using beds and having stuff in their cage for them and a clear spot where the litter box is, they're probably going to naturally be drawn to it. If not, it's just going to take a little bit of dedicated training to get them to do that. In their section on ferret handling, they do mention that baby ferrets nip, and it says that it's something that they will probably grow out of. Now, it says to spank your ferrets. What they're stressing in this section is that kits will bite because they want or need something. They talk a lot about how a kit will normally bite you more when they're hungry, and I think that that is something that is true. Ferrets bite because they're trying to communicate. My biggest biter right now is Andromeda, and she normally just bites because she wants me to pick her up or she wants attention. The easiest thing you can do with your ferret is just explain to them that I am a human being and I am very fragile. When you bite me, it hurts, so that those bites either turn gentler or they learn to express their desires in another way. We've reached the diet section, which is what I'm very curious about for all of these books. The bulk of your ferret's diet should be high quality, commercial, dry cat chow. I'm glad they mention high quality. I don't see a mention of ferret kibble, at least not yet. Maybe that's on the next page. I don't know if at this point Marshall's just hadn't started selling their kibble. They actually haven't mentioned mills or anything about where to get a ferret from. I'm really not sure when mill breeding started to become common. It says you can feed dry or canned cat food, which again is true. I just wish I could take back the sentence I read. Ferrets can be given any fruits, vegetables, or meat scraps that they will eat. This is not true, obviously. I think anyone on my channel knows you should not feed your ferrets fruits and vegetables, but I mean, at least they mention meat scraps. I don't know, it's something. Okay, it does say ferrets generally should not be allowed to eat sweets, which aren't good for them. A few licks of ice cream once every few months, however, is probably not going to hurt them. Oh, we've gotten to a sentence all right. There is absolutely no reason whatsoever to feed your ferret mice, birds, toads, frogs, or any other small animal. Someone having a bad dream over there? Did you get scared when you heard that sentence? You're not supposed to eat birds. She's gonna be devastated. It's duck night for dinner. She's gonna be absolutely devastated. I'm so sorry. I mean, okay. It's kind of convoluted, because it then just goes on to say that they can be infested with parasites, so I think it's just being like, oh, you can't catch them outside and give them to your ferret, because then it says white mice that can be purchased at a pet store will, of course, be free of these parasites. Dogs, cats, and ferrets are all carnivorous animals, and if you believe in buying mice to feed your dog or cat, then you might want to do the same for your ferret. I think they're trying to use reverse psychology to be like, oh, you wouldn't feed your dog a mouse, why would you feed it to your ferret? Except, I mean, I'd feed my dog a mouse. When I have a future dog in the future and it's raw fed, I'm probably gonna give it whole prey if it's willing to eat it. This is the page I saw when I was at the thrift store, which is what inspired this video. I just think this part is so funny. To do so, however, will not, in capitals, it's in capitals, N-O-T, capitals, improve your ferret's diet and will serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. That alone, in a ferret care textbook, is proof of where we've come, at least talking about natural feeding and raw feeding and that sort of stuff in the last, wait, when was this published? 30 years. In the last 30 years. I'm so curious where the author to this book came to that conclusion. By this point, raw feeding, there were people doing it, of course, but it just wasn't very popular. Because I'm very curious if this author had actually been like, hey, I'm gonna try and feed my ferret some mice. I'm curious if they would actually see the difference in the health. Obviously, they'd have to do it for a prolonged period and like compare it to the kibble-fed ferrets, but I just think such a strong statement with that capital not and that capital no for something that I would assume the author hadn't tried. Just interesting. Ferrets are instinctively clean and very much creatures of habit. In addition, they like to use a corner for their toilet. And I like that it says whether or not you'll be keeping your ferret in a cage. This book actually does a pretty good job of talking about free roaming and how ferrets don't necessarily need to be caged. In my opinion, I'm partial to the idea of keeping a cage, as you can tell by the fact that I have a cage right there. My ferrets are out of their cage for around 12 hours every day, but I still have a cage just because I like to keep them in it at night and when I'm not home, just for safety reasons. It does say you can use clay litter for your ferrets. That's something that we, as a community and ferret owners, have decided is not true. They do mention that pine pellets, newspaper pellets, that sort of stuff is better because it's better at deodorizing and it doesn't clump to their paws, so hopefully that means more people were using that back then. This whole section is actually pretty good. They're going into nail trimming and stuff like that. I mean, it does say bathing your ferret's not necessary, but an occasional bath will help to keep your pet odor-free. No, this is not true. Bathing is mostly just to clean them if they've gotten into something or help remove coats during seasonal coat changes. Bathing actually makes them smell worse. I just did a video on this. And it says to use baby shampoo, which I would not recommend doing, but it makes sense that that was the standard back then. Most ferrets can be bathed as often as once every week or 10 days without drying out their skin. No! Oh my god. God, can you imagine bathing your ferret that often? They'd smell so bad. Okay, we're going into ferret health now, which is another section that I was really interested in seeing. So it says that ferrets should be vaccinated yearly for distemper, which I agree with. And then it goes on to say you might want to vaccinate for rabies. Oh, okay, so we're talking about ferret safety here. And this is when they bring up wearing bells on their collars. The bell on the ferret's collar serves as a warning for when the animal is underfoot. Should the animal slip out of the house, the identification tag may help him reunite with his owner. Yeah, because they all have tags on them as well, which I think is interesting because that's just not something that people do anymore. If you're gonna have something like that for your ferrets, people will sometimes chip their ferrets. So this chapter, I think, is a little scary and a little intimidating. She just spent 5 pages talking about how when your ferret is in heat, you gotta get them to the vet right away and they need to have emergency surgery and they might die. I just think that maybe they should have led with the fact that you could get a Jill jab, because now I'm at the end of the section and they're saying, oh, by the way, just get a Jill jab. That's more down to how I would have structured this chapter if I were to write it. I mean, I think it is very good that the author spent so much time stressing how important it was to make sure that you were prepared for a female ferret to be in heat if you have a female ferret. This is something that I'm personally not experienced with because though I do have 5 female ferrets, because they are originally from a ferret mill, they were spayed at far too young an age. Things I'll get into in a future video. If you guys are curious to learn about Jill jabs and that sort of reproductive health with ferrets, I really recommend my friend Bethy, her channel Dook. She has more knowledge and first-hand experience, so go watch her videos. I will have some linked down below, or just go look at her channel, which I will have somewhere on my screen at this point. The thing that this book never mentions when talking about castration and neutering is the age that you should be doing that at. And I'm curious if that's because at this point there weren't as many studies done on adrenal disease and the effects early spay and neuter have on the development of adrenal disease. So in the section on play and personality, this book says several times that ferrets don't necessarily need a playmate, and I do think that having lone ferrets was a little bit more common back in the day, just based on what I've seen and what I've heard from people who are more in the older generation of ferret care and possibly stuck more in that mindset. I'm very curious why that was the mindset, when nowadays I think most ferret owners will agree that you should have multiple ferrets because they are such a social species. So that's the end of the first book that I have got. Once again, this book was written in 1989, which is 32 years ago. So that's a pretty old book on ferret care. And honestly, though this book has obviously outdated things in it, I was expecting that. This book stresses the importance of making sure that your ferret is going to the vet and isn't in its cage for its entire life, which I think is super awesome. I think a lot of people nowadays don't take their ferrets to the vet. And I'm not saying you need to rush your ferret to the vet, you know, every time your ferret sneezes funny, but I think there's a lot of people out there who don't go to their annual appointments, which they should definitely be doing. Another thing that I love that this book does is it really equates ferrets to dogs and cats when it comes to their place in the house. Lots of people see ferrets as small pets, they see them as hamsters or something that just needs to stay in its cage its entire life, and this book does a really good job of showing you exactly why that's not true and why ferrets deserve the same care and attention and monetary sacrifice? Yeah, monetary sacrifice. Let's go with that word. I sound smart saying it even though I just clearly didn't know what I was trying to say. We're moving on from that. I don't know where the sentence was going. It just makes it seem like ferrets are important and they're not the kind of thing you can just, throw in a cage and forget about. Next book. So the next book we're reading is Training Your Pet Ferret. It is by Gary Buskis and Barbara Somerville. And it was written in 1997, so that makes this book Oh, 24 years old. I was born in 1996. I should have been able to figure that one out. So they show a picture of a ferret cage, which is terrible. The page next to it has a slightly better cage, I guess, but it's still super bare and the ladders don't have any coverings and there's like 2 places to sleep. Oh, it says, carpet the wire ladders or slip them into hockey socks. Platforms should be made soft and safe with fleecy covers or carpet. Okay, sweet. So they mentioned that, but again, they're still showing a picture of ferrets with wire flooring. Why don't you just show a picture of what the cage should look like instead of showing where it shouldn't look like? And then, some people, self-included, don't like to read and I just want to look at the pictures. So maybe I'm just going to look at the pictures of this book and I'm not going to read it. Now, while the book that we just read talked about how you don't need to use wood shavings for your ferret cage and you should use blankets and stuff, this book actually gives a reason as to why. Cedar chips can cause respiratory problems because of the naturally occurring chemicals in the cedar. While the other book just said your ferret can have high quality cat food, this book specifically states that ferrets need their food to be at least 32% protein, and the fat content should be between 20 and 30%. And then it goes into the commercial ferret kibbles. It mentions 8-in-1 Ferret Ultra Blend, Hagen Ferret Diet, Marshall Premium Ferret Diet, Path Valley Farm Ferret Food, or Totally Ferret. Now, the only ones I'm actually familiar with on this list is the Marshall one and the Totally Ferret one. What I find interesting is that Hagen, Marshall, and Path Valley, which are like the 3 main ferret mills in North America, all have their own food. I don't know if they still do, or if it's just the Marshall one that has continued to be around. And then it says you can feed IAMS or Science Diet, which I wouldn't recommend doing, and I also wouldn't recommend feeding any of the other foods that this book has recommended. Okay, it does say don't use dog food and stay away from cheap cat or kitten foods. Now, I will say Science Diet and IAMS back in the day, those were really considered like the top tier quality foods. And in my opinion, and the opinion of many others, in the last several years as other brands have come out, those have definitely kind of like slipped down the list of top tier quality foods, and they're definitely not considered that good quality anymore. So, at the time, that was like the best of the best that you could be feeding. So makes sense that that's why they would recommend it. This book, surprisingly, says you should be using a bowl instead of a water bottle. Now, it doesn't go into the dental reasons for using a water bottle, but it says that they drip and lots of kits don't understand how to use them, so that might lead to them being dehydrated. Okay, so this section for the collars does mention that a breakaway or stretch safety feature is better to prevent choking. So, I mean, I guess that's a little bit better than the old way of thinking. They didn't mention that at all in the previous book, so. This book talks so much about ferritone. It's talking about socializing and handling of your baby ferret when you first bring one home, and how you should just constantly be using ferritone because it's so good and they love it so much and it's a great training tool. And it's just so interesting how it seems like that was really just treated as like the magical cure for everything. And it totally explains why so many people in the old way of thinking with ferrets swear by that stuff, because it totally worked, I'm sure. You're offering your ferrets sugar, and ferrets love sugar despite how terrible it is for them. So it makes sense that people would be like, no, this totally worked for my ferrets for their training because they love this thing so much, without understanding the terrible effect it has on ferrets' health, most specifically their pancreases, which can lead to insulinoma. Ooh, no. Ooh, this is bad. Positive reinforcement training is something that has become significantly more popular when it comes to training both, dogs and ferrets and any other animal that you're trying to train. I think in the past, punishment was definitely the go-to, and this book is really proving that. It says if your ferret is doing something you don't want them to, a light flick on the nose is how you should correct it. In this book, the example that they're giving is if your ferret is playing with you and they bite you too hard, flick them on the nose and tell them no, and they will learn not to bite you that hard. The thing is, ferrets don't respond to punishment. Ferrets respond to positive reinforcement, and pretty much positive reinforcement alone. If you're flicking your ferret's nose because they're biting you and you're trying to train them not to bite you, what you're actually telling your ferret is that they're not allowed to play with you and you are not a source of fun. That is not something you want to be training your ferret. Your ferret wants to know that you do want to play with them, but there are certain ways that humans don't play. Hard biting is one of them. What you should be instead doing is redirect training. Duke Souls, go on her channel. She has a really awesome video all on training and redirection. That's how you should be training your ferret not to bite, not with punishment. Punishment just does not work for them. Oh, bless. Once again, this book does such a great job of stressing the importance of free roam time. It talks about how not every ferret can have the same amount of free roam time depending on your living conditions, where you live, your individual ferret's personality, your personality, which is all true. But it also says, keep in mind, a ferret is a companion pet, not a caged animal. Once again, the stress that ferrets need free roam time. Absolutely love that. Interestingly though, while the previous book said that some people do cage-free living, and they talked a little bit about that, this one says, however much freedom you allow him, your pet should always be in the cage when you are sleeping or out of the house. So there's a disagreement on the opinion there. Otherwise, his safety will be seriously compromised. Remember the old saying, curiosity killed the cat? Well, your ferret doesn't have 9 lives. When this book mentions clumping cat litter, it doesn't really say anything about ferrets eating it and it causing a blockage. They do mention that they might ingest it, but they don't talk about why that would be bad. However, when they talk about paper pellets, such as yesterday's news, which they name, they say some ferrets will eat this litter and paper pellets can swell up, causing internal blockage. If they're snorkeling in the clay cat clumping litter, it's a lot easier for it to get into their mouth accidentally, whereas like, this is pretty big. Like, this isn't easy for your ferret to accidentally eat. Yeah, if your ferret is eating these pellets for whatever reason, definitely switch to a different type of litter, but it's just weird that, I don't know, that's weird. Okay, so they say that you can give your ferrets cooked boneless chicken, beef, or fish. However, do not offer raw meat. It may contain harmful bacteria. Harmful bacteria for my ferrets. If only they had digestive systems that were meant to break down the bacteria in meat. No! Oh my god. They're just going through the list of vegetables you should give your ferrets, and I'm really upset about this. That hurt me. That physically hurt me to read. I feel physical pain in my body right now. I don't think I can look at it again. Other treats to try in moderation and in combination include raisin pieces. Grapes are toxic to ferrets. Please don't give your ferrets raisin pieces. Thank you. Bits of green pepper or cucumber. Smooth peanut butter, banana, watermelon, orange bits, celery, blueberries, apples, grapes. You know how upset I just got? That was because of them saying raisins. And now they've said grapes. Grapes are toxic to dogs, cats, and ferrets. Do not ever give them grapes. Literally the sentence after they say not to give raw meat, they're saying to give your ferret grapes. I'm just so glad for where we started and where we're at, I guess. That's what this frustration is making me thankful for. Okay, so then it goes on to say, ferrets don't properly digest sugars, dairy products, or carbohydrate-rich foods. You literally just described things that are so sugary and have carbs. The consistency. It just says their intestines don't process them. I mean, it's not the intestines that's the issue. It's the issue is their pancreas. I'm not going to get too deep into it. If you haven't seen my video about insulinoma and ferrets, I explain why scientifically these things are bad for the ferret's pancreas. And I think that at the time, this just wasn't studied enough. Ooh, this book is mentioning walking your ferret outside, which is something that the first book didn't mention. This book says you have to use a harness and a leash. At least they mention you shouldn't be using a collar to walk your ferret with, so, you know, even though they're saying you should put a collar on your ferret for safety reasons, they're still at least acknowledging that. This book is going into how you can train your ferret to walk on a harness. Personally, whenever I take my ferrets out on their harness, it is not much of a me walking them, it is a them walking me sort of thing. The idea they're talking about seems pretty simple. Put the target stick down with a tree, walk with your ferret, and they're gonna learn to walk next to you. I don't know if this would actually work. I sure as hell haven't tried it, and I'm actually kind of curious at this point if it would. Ooh, we're getting into carpets, and it talks about plastic runners under the door, which is something we still do nowadays. Those little plastic rolls that you can put under office chairs and stuff. That's, in my opinion, the best way to stop a ferret from digging at the carpet. And this was written in the 90s, so everyone had carpet. This was probably a really big issue. Actually, if you want carpet proofing ideas, the 90s is probably where you want to work from, because those people loved their carpets. What the hell's a scat mat? It's a shock mat. I didn't know that that was a thing, and I would have been happy to go my entire life not knowing that that was a thing. So that's it for this book. Why did it have to end on such a low? This is called Training Your Pet Ferret, and a lot of what they're recommending is punishing and then giving ferritone. I just wouldn't do either of those things. Not as impressed with this book as I was with the one previous. The next book we're looking at is called Ferrets, Providing the Best Home for your ferrets. This book was only written 4 years after the Training Your Pet Ferret book, so I'm really kind of just going to be looking through this one for any differences, because I'm curious if in those 4 years things had evolved or if they pretty much stayed the exact same. I am super curious if this book is finally going to mention something about adrenal and insulinoma, because for the second time a book failed to mention that and go into details about that, so let's see. This book right off the bat talks about how to tell if you shouldn't own a ferret. It talks about how much of a time commitment they are, how you need to be conscious of what other animals or people are living inside of your house if you're going to be a good ferret owner. The other books didn't really talk too much about what kind of people shouldn't own ferrets, and instead talked about just like the great things about owning ferrets, and I think it's really great that this one's talking about the negative sides of it too. Okay, so this book for the first time goes into where you can get a ferret from, where the other book didn't talk about that. This one says that you can get them from pet stores, local breeders, or shelters. I'm glad it brings up all three of those options. And it says whichever option you choose, look for a clean facility and knowledgeable personnel. Ooh. Oh no. Oh no, they just show a full picture of a ferret mill. I mean, they're saying it's a breeder, but this is not the conditions you should be keeping your ferrets in. This lady looks like she has like 100 ferrets. Wow, they really just put that picture in there. I'm so curious what facility this is, because if you ever went to pick up a ferret and you saw these conditions of the ferrets, no, that is not good. Your ferrets that you're getting from a breeder should be like kept in the home, around people, not just in this tiny, like, what, 1 foot by 1 foot cage? This upsets me. This legitimately upsets me. Okay, so we're talking about descending here. This book says, a growing number of people feel this surgery is unnecessary unless there's a medical reason to have it done, such as the scent glands becoming plugged. Descenting certainly is not mandatory, and it does not mean that your ferrets will no longer have an odor. Descented ferrets still smell like ferrets. So I'm really glad that this book talks about descenting, and it mentions that it's not going to make your ferret not smell bad anymore, and it mentions that some people are against it. So that could have just been a change in the times, which is really great that we see that change starting to happen. Personally, I'm against descenting ferrets. It's just an unnecessary surgery, and it's why? You don't need to do it. It doesn't do anything. Okay, we're going into food now, so this is the section that I start to get a little bit scared. They mention fluctuations of weight during wintertime, which is something the other two books didn't talk about yet. Oh, this is exciting. It says, but just because it says ferret on the bag doesn't mean you should buy the product without checking the ingredients. And again, they say that it should be between 32 and 40% animal protein and 20 to 30% fat. Pretty similar to what the book we just read was telling us about their nutritional requirements. This book is bringing up an interesting idea that the other book didn't. It says, some ferret owners mix several brands of food to ensure nutritional balance and provide a little variety. Others feel that mixing brands is not necessary if you're using a high-quality food formulated for ferrets. The mixing of different brands of kibble is something that's pretty common in the ferret owner community. Lots of people who feed their ferrets kibble will feed at least 2 to 3 different ones for the exact same reasons that this person says, nutritional balance. The basic idea is that if there's one food you're feeding that has gaps in certain areas, by feeding another food you're going to be able to fill those gaps. I totally agree with the theory, and I definitely agree that it is something you should be doing. You can supplement your ferret's diet with small quantities of cooked meat, eggs, fruit, and vegetables. Just remember that such treats should be given sparingly, a teaspoon a day or so. I mean, it kind of sucks that they're putting meat and eggs in the same category as fruits and vegetables, but you know, at least they're kind of encouraging people not to overfeed fruits and vegetables. The other book sort of made it sound like you could give them as much as you wanted, because at no point did they say, hey, only give your ferret this many grapes per day. Whereas this one's saying limited. Oh my god, I see the word pancreas. This is exciting. It says, refined sugars can damage a ferret's pancreas, which can reduce in diabetes or insulinoma later in life. Oh, for once, we have a mention of insulinoma, but the problem is it's not just refined sugars, it's carbs in general, but at least they're starting to get the idea, so that's exciting. And they mentioned that chocolate is toxic. If only they also mentioned that grapes and raisins were toxic, that'd be great. Mentions teeth brushing. None of the other books mention teeth brushing yet. Okay, this is interesting. The collar section starts off by saying, the use of collars on ferrets is a bit controversial. So, possibly in the ferret care community between the time of these two books getting written, some people were starting to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. Basically, the author describes the two sides of the argument. The one side, which is the more old school way of thinking, where it's to alert you where your ferret is, and if your ferret gets lost, someone will be able to bring it back to you. But she mentions that a lot of ferret owners think that they are choking hazards. They are convinced that if the collar is tight enough that the ferret isn't able to slip out of it, that means that it's going to choke them, and also it can get caught on things, and these are both my concerns as well. For the first time, this book is mentioning microchipping your ferrets. I wonder if when microchipping started to become more common, that's when people started to shift their thinking about whether or not collars were good. Because at that point, people were maybe like, you know, if one of the reasons our ferrets are wearing collars is so that if they get lost, we can find them, well, now we've eliminated that problem, so maybe we should rethink the collar thing. It talks about how you should be taking your ferrets to the vet at least once a year, and then twice a year after they are 3 years old, which is something that the other books didn't mention, despite mentioning annual visits. And it's also saying that after 3 years old, whole body x-rays and blood tests are recommended, something that hadn't been mentioned in the other books yet. Insulinoma, lymphoma, and adrenal has come up for the first time. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because when they talk about adrenal, they don't mention anything about early spay and neuter. They mention that the theory behind it is that it is genetic, when actually we know now that it's more linked to early spaying and neutering. So that just means more studies have come out in recent years, which is great. It's great news that we've advanced. So that is Ferrets, providing the best home for your ferret. Considering how there's only a 4-year gap between these two books, there is a substantial gap in information and just the detail that they go into. I mean, who knows? It could just be that this book isn't as good of a book. I'm not saying that Ferret Care in 1997 was awful and then for some reason in 2001 it got like a million times better. I think this book is actually pretty on par with the second edition of Ferrets for Dummies. If I were to be someone who was owning a ferret in those early 2000s when these books were both written, I would definitely want both of them on my shelf, and I probably would have recommended this book to people back in the day if that's when I had my YouTube channel. Was YouTube alive in 2001? We have one more book. This book is a little bit different than the other ones. So this is Small Animal Care and Management 2nd edition. As opposed to the other books, which are just like ferret care guides, this book not only is for all small animals, but this is actually a textbook that would probably have been used in maybe an intro-level university course or maybe even a high school course. I thought it was an interesting find because then that sort of gives a light on what was taught to possibly even the veterinarians that are working on your ferrets right now. Of course, this wouldn't have been the only thing that they learned about ferrets, but this looks like it's like an intro-level book, so it would have been what possibly they started with. It was published in 2002, so just a year after the one that we just finished looking at. I am very curious what it is going to say. First, I need to find the ferret section in it, though, because it has pretty much every animal. Oh, okay, so we're talking about cages here. They're talking about sizes and stuff. Last book says you should not use a glass terrarium to cage your ferrets. This book says glass aquariums can be used to house ferrets, but are not desirable. But it still says that they can be used, and that upsets me. I don't know, I still think that that's something we should just hard no on, you know? I don't think that should be a sometimes it'll work. I'll admit there's a lot of gray area with ferret ownership, but I just don't think an aquarium is one of them. For the first time, this book also says ferrets can be kept outside all year round. The other books didn't really mention ferrets being, like, housed outside. Not that I'm against the idea, I just think that it really depends on where you live, which is not what they're bringing up. Okay, so this book says specifically that you should be feeding kitten food as opposed to cat food because kitten food is higher in protein, but it doesn't go into the nutritional requirements, whereas the other books gave, you know, the percent of protein in fat food should be. This book doesn't say anything about that. Okay, what? Okay, this is interesting. This book says meat scraps, fruit, red licorice, and ice cream can be used for treats. One of the other books we talked about said you should never give your ferrets red licorice. They specifically mentioned that. And it was in the same section that they were talking about, you know, candy and chocolate and stuff. They didn't even say vegetables. They said meat, fruit, red licorice, and ice cream can be used as treats. And that's literally all they say about diet. They don't mention anything about raw meat. Not that I, like, expected them to say, oh, you can feed your ferret raw, but the other books at least said you shouldn't do it. There was at least mention of it, whereas this book says absolutely nothing. In the training section, they say that you can thump your ferret on the end of the nose to punish them. So we're back in the punishment world. The positive reinforcement world has left us. We left that in 2001, and unfortunately it's 2002 now, and we're doing punishment again. I read a sentence that made me sad. It said, rabies among ferrets is rare because the animals are usually confined to a cage. But they shouldn't be confined to a cage. I mean, that's really basically all this book says about ferrets. Like, granted, this book is significantly shorter. We get 10 pages as opposed to a full book dedicated to ferrets. No mention of insulinoma or adrenal or lymphoma in their diseases and ailments section, which I think you should probably talk about cancer when you're talking about ferrets. Even back in 2002, The last book talked quite extensively about cancer, so it's obviously something that the ferret community was aware of and scientists had the proof for. This one was pretty vague. You know, it covered the basics, which I guess was the point of this book. And you know, this book isn't the kind of ferret care book that someone would go and buy because they're interested in learning about ferrets. This is very much the kind of book that would be given to them for a class, which is why I wanted to look through it, because I was curious what this said about ferrets. And I can tell you it said not much. I think this was a very interesting insight into the evolution of ferret care. Granted, this is only 4 books. I'm sure that what Dr. Wendy said in this book was not the opinion of every single ferret owner in 1989. I'm sure there were people with other opinions, and obviously there were people raw feeding and people who did things differently than Dr. Wendy. But I still think by looking at these 4 books, we can see a bit of the evolutionary change in what was considered the norm for ferret care. What I find interesting you know what, I'm gonna talk about these 3 books. This book was useless to me. What I think is interesting in these 3 books is the evolution that seemed to happen where ferrets were treated more like cats and dogs as house animals that were outside of their cage. And it seemed like by the 3rd book, they were treated more as caged pets with less emphasis on how much they needed to be outside of their cage exploring their environment. But along with that, there was an evolution in the scientific understanding of ferrets, especially when it comes to the development of cancers, the effects of certain food on their body, and that sort of stuff. If we're gonna take anything away from this video, it's this. Pet care is constantly evolving and constantly changing, and that is an amazing thing. Whether you are someone who has owned ferrets for 20 years or 20 minutes, the way you take care of your ferrets is eventually going to change, and that's not bad. We should not be scared of progress, and we should not be scared of change. The way that I've owned my ferrets for the last 5 years had changed so much. The more I've learned, the more people I've talked to, and the more studies that have been put out. And I don't think that's something to be ashamed of. I think that that's something to celebrate, because that means that we, as ferret owners, as a society, and as people, care more about positive change than we care about sticking to our old ways of living. So yes, that's what I want you guys to take away. Don't be scared to change. Don't be scared for the evolution of animal care. I will possibly not be posting a video next Sunday. I'll see what happens. Just don't hold me to it if it doesn't happen. If not, I will be posting a video later in the week because I have exciting things happening that I need to tell you guys about. I'm really good at balancing books on my head, and this is my subtle way of proving that to you guys. They've only been here for about 4 minutes while I've been ranting about nothingness, so like, whatever, it's not a big deal or anything. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because by doing all of those things, you too can become a citizen of the friendly neighborhood, which in my personal and professional opinion is the very best place that you can be. I will see you guys next week, possibly, when I do something. I'm not quite sure what yet. That's a lie. I am, which is why I'm telling you that it might be a little bit later, because I don't plan that far ahead. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. Thank you for letting me ramble. Goodbye.